Welcome to class number 8 in the Sefer Sheva Mitzvot HaShem, written by Rabbi Moshe Weiner, and this is the original of the translation of the commonly known the Divine Code. And we are currently in the preface to the entire series. So we are right now on top of page 44 in volume 1 of the book Sefer Sheva Mitzvot HaShem. We're in the middle of discussing in detail the Rambam, Maimonides, when he makes the statement, and he actually gives the legal ruling that it is obligatory for the Jewish people to compel, to force, if you will, the nations of the world, the Umay Sa'olam, to keep their 7 God-given laws, the 7 Noachide commandments, as they're well known, the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide commandments given by God to all of mankind through Moses at Sinai. And we're discussing at this point who exactly is obligated, in what situation. So just to very, very briefly summarize or recap where we're up to at this point, just to highlight in very general terms. There are different opinions, the Rambam's contemporaries, who disagree with certain details. But overall, everyone agrees that there is the obligation and the responsibility of the Jewish people to influence, to see to it, to get the non-Jews to keep their 7 mitzvahs. Having said that, we're now up to third line on page 44, where it says Beis. B. Nire Barur Barambam Hilches Melachim Seif Perek Tes. It appears clearly from the Rambam Maimonides in the Laws of Kings at the end of chapter 9. The mitzvahs dinim, that this mitzvah of having a court system, of judging people that transgress and they are not keeping the other 6 laws, he mitzvah kollektivit, it's a collective commandment. Kloimar, meaning to say, chala al kol hachevra, that it actually applies to all of society. As a reminder, the 7 Noachide commandments, for the most part, 6 out of the 7 are negative. They're prohibitions, what not to do, not to kill, not to steal, etc. The 7th one is the only positive one, and that is dinim, to judge. So the question is, who has that obligation of judging? Is it only an appointed official, an appointed or an elected judge? See, when it comes to the other ones, they're obviously individual commandments for every individual person. Every individual is forbidden to kill, to steal, etc. So here, he's explaining that when it comes to the positive commandment of having a system where people are judged, that is a collective commandment which applies to all of society. Gam al hamemshala v'gam al kol yachid. Both on the government, on the governing body of the country, or the city, or the province at that time, as well as on every individual. Every personal individual has this mitzvah upon him. And therefore, everyone is punished. The individuals are punished as well for not having a proper judicial system, as the Rambam explains. If I may, I'll bring in just an example, which may be familiar for those that study the Torah, the written Chumash, what's known as the Bible. So you may recall in Genesis the story of the daughter of Yaakov, of Jacob, Dinah. And she was kidnapped and raped. And her two brothers, Shimon and Levi, basically killed the entire city. They wiped out the entire city of Shechem. That's the story the way it appears in the Chumash, in the Bible. So the question one may ask is, why did they do that? One individual kidnapped her, etc. So why kill out the whole city? So the way that it's explained is that everybody, every member of that city, all of the citizens were liable for the death penalty for transgressing. What did they transgress? They may not have stolen. They may not have committed adultery or rape or anything of that nature. However, because they were part of a corrupt system that didn't have in place a way and a means, obviously, to judge the individual that did it. He was not taken to court. He was not put to death for his crime. Therefore, every individual in that city at that time had been a transgressor of this one of the 7 Nochad commandments, namely dinim, of lacking to have a judicial system. So it's not only the judge or the governor or the mayor or the government, it's every individual as well. ובפרט לפי הגרסה שמובאת ברמב"ם מצוות פרנקל וכן ובתוקף הרמב"ן, and especially if you read in the Rambam and Maimonides according to the version which is brought down in an accurate edition of the Rambam known as the Frankel edition, which has just been coming out in our generation just a few decades ago. And likewise, this is the way that the Ramban Nachmanides brings it down. And that is as follows. Ra echad mehem chaveroi sha'asa avera v'loi danoi. If one of them, one of the nations of the world, one goy, any non-Jew, witnessed his friend, a fellow human being, that transgressed, and he didn't judge him, so the innocent, so to say, innocent observer, and I say innocent in quotations, the innocent observer who is minding his own business has transgressed a capital offense by being passive, by minding his own business, by doing nothing, by failing to judge the individual that he saw transgressing any one of the 7. He himself now has become a transgressor. Which has he transgressed? Dinim, judging. So from those words, from that reading, it's quite obvious that this is a mitzvah commandment for every single individual. And the Ramban, Nachmanides, also does not disagree. He's not arguing on the Rambam on Maimonides in this detail. Rather, that which the Rambam writes, that the nations of the world, that the non-Jews are punished by death for failing to keep a positive commandment. Just in that detail does he differ. But otherwise he agrees that any non-Jew that sees another non-Jew transgressing and doesn't bring him to judgment is actually himself committing passively a capital offense. Venireli, and it appears to me, says this author, Rabbi Weiner, Shein bekavonas Rambam, ראה אחד מהם חברו שעשה עבירה, ולא ידענוי, הרי זה נהרג שעבר על מצוות דינים, רק על הדיין שהיה ראוי לדונוי ולא ידענוי. It appears to me that the intention of the Rambam in these words that we quoted, and again he quotes them, that if one non-Jew sees another human being, another non-Jew, that he transgressed and he did not judge him, behold, he is to be put to death for transgressing the mitzvah of dinim, of having a judicial system. That is not referring merely to a judge that is in the position of being able to judge and being able to express his opinion and bring him to justice. Ella, rather, af al acher she'ena yochei ladunoi, but even on another person who cannot judge him, he doesn't have the authority or the power to judge his fellow. But what he could have done, why is he liable for a capital offense? Because he could have brought him to court, he could have testified against him in a court of law. So, to mind one's own business, when you see a fellow non-Jew transgressing any one of the 7 Noachide commandments and not stepping forward and going to court and testifying against him, that is the capital offense of dinim. Gam hu avar al mitzvahs dinim. So he too then has transgressed this mitzvah, this commandment of dinim, of judging. Ve'efsher nenash mavis al zeh, k'mo yadayin shebitul mitzvahs dinim. And it's possible that he too will be punished by death, just as the judge that transgressed. If the judge didn't judge someone, and he said, no, I'm not interested, or whatever, or he just dismissed the case, so that judge is a transgressor, which needs to be put to death. So too, the individual which didn't have the ability and the power and the authority to judge. However, he could have at the very least come to the court and testified, and he didn't, possible that he too should be put to death according to the Rambam. V'nireh miloshen Rambam sham, and it appears from the language of the Rambam there, lemanes shoiftim sheishpetu ulahazir es ha'am, to judge, to appoint judges that shall judge, and then the Rambam's words are, and to warn the people. The azharas ha'am, this warning of the people, hainu means lelamdam ulafrisham me'isur, to teach them and thereby to separate them from the prohibition. So that is actually the responsibility, and that is part of the task of the judges. To educate, to inform, to teach the people what they may and may not do. That's part of what they need to do. That's how they'll see to it that the people do not transgress. Hare shechoivas dinim einay rak bedin shiput vanisha. So it comes out, according to this, that the obligation of dinim, of judging, is not merely to actually judge something which took place, an individual which has transgressed, and to punish. Elogam bedaigo litikinus hachevra, but also to be concerned with the betterment of society. So part of the obligation, part of the mitzvah of dinim, is for the governing body as well as every individual to see to it to have a proper society that is going to adhere and observe and keep the 7 Noachide commandments. Ukvias takonois sheyimna meha'am lavar averos. And part of their obligation and responsibility is to establish and to make decrees that will withhold the people from transgressing. So therefore, this is not something which is clear-cut, and it's not black on white and etched in stone, as the 7 mitzvahs are. part of this seventh mitzvah of dinim is up to the discretion, this part of it that is, of the local court system and whatever they see the need. So this can vary from time to time or from location to location. And you can have in one country or in one city where the rule is such, and that's all in order to prevent people from transgressing any of the seven. And in a different place, they have a different rule in place. But basically, the fundamental purpose is all the same. And that is that it's the responsibility of the people to see to it, to make rules, to implement all sorts of laws and rules and decrees so that people will not transgress. Uvereish v'rishayna, and first and foremost, chinuch v'limud shel Sheva Mitzvot HaShem v'chadoimeh, to educate and to teach the seven Noachite commandments and the like. So that's the first thing that the governing body has responsibility to do. So regardless of the language, of the location, of the country, of the nationality, it makes no difference. These are the seven universal laws for all of mankind, divine laws given by God Almighty. And therefore, in every and any given time, and in every and any geographic location, every nationality has the responsibility to inform, educate, and teach people these seven commandments. And that's all part of dinim. That falls under the category of the seventh mitzvah of judging, to inform the people and to teach them what they may and may not do, beginning with the seven mitzvahs. Gimel. We're towards the bottom of page 44. C. Medivrei HaRambam, from the words of the Rambam, and we quote, Tziva Moshe Rabbeinu mipi hagvura, lo chayfes kol boi ha'olam chuli. That Moses, our teacher, has commanded from God Almighty to force all the inhabitants of the world, etc., to keep the seven. Move on. It is understood from these words, Shatzivui hu teiras Moshe, that this commandment is actually part of the Mosaic, part of Moses' law, the God-given law through Moses. And just like all of the commandments, all of these, so to say, Jewish commandments, they are in effect and they apply to the group as well as the individual. Unless, of course, it is explained differently. There could be exceptions, and there could be particular commandments which only apply to the group as a whole, but not to individuals. But other than that, if it doesn't say so explicitly, any and every commandment in the Torah equally applies to the nation as a whole, to the community, as well as to every individual. So too the seven Noachite commandments. The Rambam is very exact, very precise in his choice of words throughout the entire Mishneh Torah, throughout the magni opus of his writing of the laws, which obviously is written for the Jewish people, and it's all of Jewish law. But then we have the Sheva Mitzvot HaShem here towards the end of the laws of kings. When he chooses which words to say and how to say it, it is crucial. So when the Rambam writes over here very clearly that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, was commanded from God, and this is ideally the way that every non-Jew is supposed to accept these seven laws, as we've discussed many times in previous classes, not only because they're moral, and not only because they're divine, but because they're given by God through Moses. So that means to say that they fall into the same category as the Jewish mitzvahs for the Jewish people, meaning to say they apply to the general community at large as well as to every individual, unless clearly stated otherwise. Bilukutei Sichas hoichiach In Likutei Sichos, the Rebbe Melech HaMoshiach proves the chayva zoi lachuv es kalboi ha'elam hu gam chayvas yachid. That these words of the Rambam, this obligation of forcing or compelling all the people in the world to keep them, is also an individual obligation for every individual Jew. So one cannot say that it is a collective obligation, or it's a communal obligation, or it's an obligation on the leaders of the community, or what have you. No. In volume 26, as he brings down in the footnote, volume 26, page 135, the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach clearly proves, unequivocally, that this obligation is upon every individual. Meharambam Hilchos Mila Perek Aleph. And he proves it from the words of the Rambam in the laws of circumcision. Not here in the laws of kings, but going all the way back towards the beginning. Chapter 1. Shepasak, that the Rambam ruled, that a Jew who acquires a non-Jewish slave, generally referred to as an Eved Knaani, from non-Jews. So a Jew bought a slave, a non-Jewish person, to be his slave. Koife oisoi, he forces him, sheikayim Sheva Mitzvot, that he shall fulfill the 7 commandments. V'nisbayer le'el, and it was explained above, hasagas haravid, the criticism of the Ravid, the main critic of the Rambam, the maskim la Rambam, that the Ravid in fact agrees with the Rambam, she'asur l'kayem eved lakuach, that it is forbidden for the Jew to allow this acquired slave of his to exist, to continue to be. Elohim came, unless Yekabel Sheva Mitzvot HaShem bizman hazeh, unless he accepts the 7 Noachide commandments, and this applies even nowadays. So, without getting into the legal situation of how and when and where it's possible for a Jew to own an Eved Knani, but putting that aside, let's for the moment assume that it's possible, although today in practice we don't own Avadim, and no Jew owns an Eved, a slave. But putting that aside, in the time where a Jew can own an Eved Knani, even though it's past the time of the Yovel, there is no possibility to have the Jubilee year in effect. There is no Yovel. But there still could be an Eved Knani. Fine. Even then, a Jew may not allow his Eved to exist, to continue to be, unless he accepts upon himself to keep the 7. So what is understood from their words, from the Rambam as well as from the Ravid, that even nowadays, that the obligation for the Jew to compel the Noachites, which is a general term for all non-Jews, doesn't matter whether you consider yourself to be part of a certain belief or group or whatever. B'nai Noach is the generic term for all human beings that are not Jewish. All right? Not just people that say, oh, I'm a Noachite, because that means that you accept it and you know and you formally or informally or whatever, keep the 7. No, Ben Noach is the term for all and every human beings that are not Jewish. So nowadays as well, there is an obligation for the Jew to compel the Bnei Noach, and this applies even on the individual, every individual Jew, and in all times. For the Rambam, as well as the Ravid, did not make this law dependent on any other additional conditions. Hooray, so behold, Shachoiva eina b'miskeres kfiyas based in levad. So this obligation to see to it that everyone keeps the 7 Noachite commandments is not in the framework of a judicial system, of a court that needs to force people. El al kol echad she'efshari loy mishum tzivui Moshe. But rather on any and every individual that is able to. And that is because the commandment going back to God's commandment to and through Moshe, Moses our teacher. So every Jew that is obligated to follow the Torah that was given to us through Moses has an obligation that whenever he can, if he has the ability, he must see to it that the Bnei Noach keep their 7 mitzvahs. Nothing to do with being in the land of Israel, nothing to do with Ger Toishav, nothing to do with the Yovel, Jubilee year, nothing to do with the temple standing, Beis HaMikdash, nothing to do with the time of the diaspora, exile. It's all the time, in every generation. The only thing is, as the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach explains there in that talk, the reason why the Jewish people weren't doing this throughout history, at least for the past couple thousand years, basically, until very recently, is because they weren't able to. In almost all cases, with very few exceptions, that we do actually find, historically speaking, and documented, that there were individual cases here and there. But those were clearly the exception. And the reason is because the Jews couldn't, because of the situation of exile. Not that they didn't have an obligation because it doesn't apply in exile or outside of the land of Israel. They simply couldn't. And thank God that changed. Top of page 45, in the brackets. Ve'af al pi shemistaber, and although it makes sense, shekfias evet kazeh hu mitam hapan hashlili bedinim shelo yekalkel chevras Yisrael. Although it does logically make sense that the reason why such an Evet Knani owned by a Jew, that he must be forced to keep the 7, could be that this is part of the negative aspect of the mitzvah of dinim, of judging, meaning we don't want this person to ruin the Jewish society, the Jewish community. If you have an individual who's part of the community, I mean, he is an Eved, a slave owned by the Jew, working for the Jew 24/7. So if he is an individual that is not living up to the proper godly standards demanded of a human being, namely to keep the 7 mitzvahs, that will have a negative effect on the Jewish community. So one can say that's why the Jewish owner, his Jewish master, is obligated to force him to keep the 7. Mikol makoim, nonetheless, ha'haichacham mevu'eres shematzinu chiyuv kfiya gam ala yachid likveis b'nenecha kaim sheva mitzvahs. That having been said, the question is, how can we prove from there about a regular relationship between a Jew and his non-Jewish neighbor, when this is somebody who's owned by the Jew, and therefore we're afraid he would have a negative effect on that Jew or on the community? Nonetheless, what we're using that case to prove is that the forcing of a non-Jew to keep the 7 is an obligation on the individual as well as on the court system. It's not just something which is the governing body or the court has to implement. That's the point we're trying to bring from there. And furthermore, it seems that we could learn from the Sifri, that's part of the Talmudic tradition, on the verse, V'sholcha l'nafsha v'loi leveis elokeha, shenisbar le'el, v'pashtus koy al hayochid. Just to remind you, he brought this earlier, above, and that is by the mitzvah of the Yifas Toyar, which is basically when a Jewish soldier goes to war and he sees there a woman, not Jewish, in the enemy territory, from the enemies, and he wishes to take her. So the Torah says that in a very specific, detailed conditions, he can take her and bring her back. And then, if she chooses to convert and become Jewish, then he may keep her as a wife, and she becomes Jewish. If, however, she doesn't, then he forces her to keep the Sheva Mitzvot HaShem. He sends her back home. As a Gentile, she's sent back home. Now the verse says he sends her lenafsha, for her life. And from that the Sifri learns out, and not to the house of her God. In other words, for her true life, which means to serve the one and only God that every human being is obligated to serve, and not anything of idolatry. So if she comes from an idolatrous background, if she comes from an idolatrous home, if she served other gods, that is forbidden. And he doesn't send her back to that. And therefore, if she doesn't accept upon herself not to worship avodah zarah, idolatry, well, then she'll be put to death. So she needs to accept that she will not worship avodah zarah, and then he sends her freely home. So that's clearly a case of an individual, because the case of a Yafas Toyar is really for an individual soldier who went to war. It's not by the Jewish court. It's not by the generals of the army. This is a very particular mitzvah for any and every Jewish soldier that went out to war. And usually it's because, classically, it's because the Torah recognizes the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that a person has, especially during war when he's killing and all these things are going on. So psychologically it's explained. And therefore, instead of telling the person that she's forbidden, which may not be possible for the person to withhold himself and restrain himself at that time in that situation, so therefore God allows for it under these conditions. That's an individual. And yet that individual has to see to it that she denounces avodah zarah. Behold, we see that even an individual Jew is commanded to see to it that the Bnei Noach keep their 7 mitzvahs. And so it seems simple and obvious from the words of the commentary called Preface on the tractate Chagiga, which was mentioned earlier, that they write that it is a commandment for the Jew to instruct the non-Jews of their 7 commandments. And clearly there it's also referring to the individual Jew. It's not a communal commandment. It's not a commandment that the Beis Din, that the Jewish court or the non-Jewish court or this governing body. Besides that, it is a commandment for every individual Jew. Dalit. D. Al-pi ma shenisbar le'el Sif Beis. Perush Lashon Rambam lahazir es ha'am. That which we mentioned above in section B, just the previous page, in the meaning, the interpretation of the words of the Rambam, to warn the people. Shechoiv al hadayonim gam lulamed lo machukim. So he said, this is the way Rabbi Weiner explained it on the previous page, that it's actually an obligation for the judges to inform and to educate and to teach the people the laws, the 7. Not merely to just judge them for transgressing. So it's not just that the function of the judge is, that person, he transgressed, and there's testimony against him. He stole. Kill him. That's also part of their function. That is part of dinim. But not only. It's to bring about a situation where people know and understand what they're not allowed to do. And hopefully, the dinim, the court, won't have to kill people because people won't be transgressing the 7. Nire, so it appears from that, shebichlal mitzvas dinim, that included in this commandment of judging, choyvos neisofim, there are additional obligations that the people have, again, collectively as a community and individually. Kegoin, for example, chinuch lahakaras elokim, to educate the people to recognize that God exists. V'kiyum Sheva Mitzvot HaShem, and to fulfill, to keep his 7 commandments. V'chein shar erkei and noishus, and likewise the rest of the moral values. V'chein hashpa al chaverim bidvarim k'minag Avram shnitzkelel, and likewise to influence one's colleagues, fellow people, with all sorts of words, to influence them. It doesn't just have to be to force them, because lakuf is a very intense word. The connotation of lakuf means to actually force, but also to influence them with words, logically, emotionally, polite, kind, pleasant. That's also acceptable. The point is, we want them, everybody, to keep the 7 mitzvahs, as was the custom of Abraham, which we mentioned above earlier. And again, to remind everyone what the Midrash says, Abraham, who lived in an area which was desert-like, and he had an open door policy. Actually, open doors, I should say. He had a tent. This was his house where he and his wife Sarah lived. There was a front door, a back door, and a side door, and a side door. All 4 sides had entrances. And the people, which are Arabs, in that time, traveling, needed a place, needed a restaurant, ran out of food, ran out of water. This was an oasis. They came to him, and he fed them very well, and gave them delicacies. He gave them steaks, and he gave them to drink. At the end, when the person would finish eating and drinking to his heart's content, he then asked the host, he asked Avraham, what do I owe you? And he would come with a bill, make a calculation, and it was enormous, the amount. It was totally exaggerated, sky high. And the person would then obviously say, that's not exactly fair and just. You know, you're very kind and polite, but then at the end you give me such a bill. So Avraham said, well, you have to realize that here in the wilderness, you couldn't get this. So this is not the regular market value. But I forgot to mention, before Avraham gave them this bill, when they asked, how much do we owe you? Initially, Avraham said, you don't owe me any payment. All you need to do is say grace to the good Lord. Praise Hashem. Bless God for the food. And if they did, great, that was it. He got a person at the time when monotheism was pretty much out of style. At that point, historically, it started off years ago, generations before it was, but by this point, the world, as far as serving and believing in God, was totally corrupt, as there are other stories about Avraham as a child, growing up in his father's home, etc., etc. So he got this person to clearly thank the Creator, the one and only God Almighty. If the person then said, no, it's against my beliefs, it's against my principles, I don't do that, then he gave him the bill, then he told him, you have a choice. And this way, he was able to, one way or another, influence, convince, or force the people to bless God. And of course, that planted a seed in their mind, and that made them start thinking how irrational and how crazy and how foolish their beliefs are, and how what Avraham is saying is the only thing which actually makes sense, fine. But that's how he did it. So too, it's an obligation on everyone, every individual, to see to it, to educate people. And where does this come in? There's only 7 Noahide commandments, one can argue. And it says, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, right? No blasphemy. Where do we have education? A limb off of a live animal? Like, where does education come in? Education is dinim. It's the one of judging them. Part of judging them means a protective measure, so to say. The whole goal of judging them is not that we want to kill people. That severe, extreme punishment is so that people don't transgress. We want people to live. We want all of mankind to live properly the way God has commanded. Ki mitzvahs dinim einay rak chiyuv hamishpat v'hanisha. For the mitzvah, the commandment of judging is not merely the obligation of judging and punishing, ela erech rachav yoser, but rather it's a broader value system. Lidoig l'tkinus hachevra kula, to be concerned with the betterment of society at large. U'memela hachoiva hazu mitzvahs dinim mutelas al kol echad ve'echad shebekoichoi hadavar. Therefore, this obligation, which is part of this mitzvah of dinim, of judging, is upon every single individual that has the ability to do so. Kloimar, this means to say, anybody who has the ability to influence others, if he's in an influential position. Kigoin, for example, the parents to educate their children. All right? Hopefully society is not that corrupt. And everybody agrees that a major part of parenthood is to educate one's own children. Hopefully everybody can agree on that. Certainly when the children are younger than the age where they may not seem to listen at all to the parents. So when you have young children, it isn't just, I'll send them off to school. The job of the school is to educate. And my job is to provide them with shelter, room and board. That's it. Or give them a good time. Or have them socialize. Or no. Parents are obligated to educate their children, and I need not elaborate. So part of that is, it's the responsibility of the parents who have an influence over their children and have the obligation to educate their children, to teach them about God and about the 7 Noahide commandments. So now, education came into the picture as well. Venirili, and it seems to me, Shezem mevur midivra Gemara Sanhedrin, that this that we just said is actually pretty clear. It's explained from the Talmud tractate Sanhedrin, as it brings down in the footnote 72. There will be 56b and 57b. Shadam Arishon, man, the first man, Adam, nitztave b'sheva mitzvahs, was commanded, says the Talmud, in 7 commandments. V'lomdum me'apasuk vayetzav v'goymer, and they derive it from a certain verse in Genesis. And they break it down. This is the oral law. So from a one word, they derive the meaning of that. So the word there says vayetzav, and God commanded Adam. And it says, and he commanded. Vayetzav elu adinim, says the Talmud. Vayetzav refers to dinim, to the commandment of having a judicial system. And likewise it says with regards to Abraham, our forefather, Ki yadaitiv, for I knew him, says God, L'ma'an, asher yitzaves banov v'espeisai achrav, that he will command his children and his household after him, V'shamru derech Hashem, and they will guard, they will keep the path, the way of God, laseis tzedakah u'mishpat, to do justice and righteousness. Banav l'din beisoy litzdaka. Banav l'din beisoy litzdaka. So we break down these two words here. It says his children and his household. So children, that refers to din. And beisoy, his house, that refers to tzedakah, to charity. So again, we find that it's all part of the mitzvah of dinim, is educating one's own household. Harei choivas dinim lavraham. So we see that the obligation of dinim, of judgment, for Abraham, is referring to that which he will educate his children and his household. So again, there we have it, education, and that's part of dinim. V'chein sivui hadinim l'adam harishain, and likewise going back to Adam, the commandment of dinim. Yesh loymar denitztave boy bayom shenivra l'kaim mitzvah zoy miyad. We can say that he was actually commanded with this commandment of dinim on the very day that he was created, immediately. Ve'af al pi shebereishis yomav lehoisa adain kayemes chevra maspekes ladunoi b'mareches mishpatis mikomo kematzivui hoya alachinuch. He says, even though the day that Adam was created, day 6 of creation, there was not enough of a society to judge him. How can he be commanded at that point to have a judicial system? You need at least a minimal society to be able to say that there's a mitzvah to judge. So therefore he's suggesting that at that point what the mitzvah meant was educate. This is a primary point of this commandment of dinim. For just as din, law, judgment, is to withhold the transgression and to warn the transgressor, ulashoftoi, and to judge him, bim avar, if he transgressed, so that to withhold repetitive sins. So if that's what judgment is all about, how much more so? That included in this, the obligation is lidoig meiroish, to be concerned from the very onset, to withhold sin through the proper education. So education is crucial, and education is part of the mitzvah of dinim. And again he's going back to that Preface that he mentioned from Tractate Chagiga, mentioned above, that they write that there's a mitzvah, there's an obligation, a commandment for the Jews to inform them, to teach them. So according to the opinion of this commentary Preface in Chagiga, there is a commandment for the Jewish people to teach the 7 Noachite commandments to the Noachites. And likewise, the Chasam Sofer, which lived just about 200 years ago, roughly, he wrote as follows in a response of his. He was a great leading rabbi who gave many rulings that, of course, are followed till this day. Asur lahachshilam. It is forbidden for the Jew to cause the Bnei Noach, the non-Jews, to stumble. V'adarabban, on the contrary, mitzvah lohiroisam, it is a commandment to instruct them, to teach them. Mashakasav Rambam Perek Yud B'Mlochim, as Maimonides writes in chapter 10 of the Laws of Kings. In footnote 74, he's dealing over here with what exactly the Chassam Sofer is referring to when he says chapter 10 in the Laws of Kings. He says that seems a little bit difficult, that reference. And therefore, Rabbi Weiner wants to suggest that there's a typo in the printed version of the Chassam Sofer, and it should really be chapter 8. Instead of chapter 10, it should be chapter 8 in the Laws of Kings, and that would be referring to what we've been discussing the whole time. In chapter 8, that it says, Tziva Moshe Rabbeinu mipi agvura lakuf, that Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded by God to force all the people, etc. That's what he's referring to. But be that as it may, the Chassam Sofer clearly says that it's forbidden for a Jew to cause another human being to transgress any one of his 7, but on the contrary, the Jew is responsible to teach him. You see, there's a particular prohibition, one of the 613 for a Jew, and that is Lifnei Iver Loisitein Michshoil, that one is not allowed to place a stumbling block in front of someone who's blind. So not only in the literal sense, but anybody who is, quote-unquote, blind, that they are lacking insight, they're lacking information, they're lacking knowledge of any particular area. So a Jew is not permitted to cause that person to stumble. And there are countless examples of what that means in practical terms. So the question one can ask is, well, the Torah says that, and speaking to the Jew, so maybe it's only between one Jew and a fellow Jew. For example, a Jew may not sell something which is not kosher to a fellow Jew, because the presumption is he'll probably use it. And therefore, the Jew that sold it or provided it, or even gave it as a gift, is allowing him, is assisting him on some level to do it. When I say kosher, it could be food, or it could be other things. For example, tefillin, phylacteries, mezuzah, without getting into it, but unfortunately, in the market, I don't know what the percentage is. I'm afraid to find out. In the market, there are many non-kosher tefillin, non-kosher mezuzahs being sold by money-hungry individuals, by non-God-fearing individuals, and maybe down the whole chain. So perhaps some of the people are innocent or not malicious and not purposely committing it. Maybe it only starts off at the top. I don't want to get into that. Fact is, if a Jew knows that a particular mezuzah is not kosher, the scroll is not kosher, and there could be any reason why it's not kosher, he is forbidden to sell or to give it as a gift to another fellow Jew, because the presumption is that that Jew will then affix it to his doorpost, thereby thinking that he's doing a mitzvah, and in fact, not. He's actually harming that person spiritually. Same thing would apply to a pair of tefillin, and again, it would be any mitzvah. So a Jew is not permitted to give non-kosher food to a fellow Jew, even if that fellow Jew, for whatever reason, unfortunately doesn't keep kosher yet. So if I know a Jew that doesn't keep kosher yet, and somehow I have non-kosher food, and that other person says, oh, I'll take that, I don't keep kosher. So I come to work, and they're giving out one day as a promotional thing or whatever, or the boss is in a great mood, and therefore he's sponsoring lunch, and everybody is getting one ham sandwich or one cheeseburger sandwich from McDonald's, whatever. And I, being a Jew, I'm disgusted by that. That's just me personally. So I, of course, decline. But then there's a fellow Jew in the office who, unfortunately, is not observant, doesn't keep kosher yet. and happens to have a real good appetite as well. And therefore he says, being that everybody is entitled to one sandwich, I want two. So can I have yours? I am forbidden to allow him to take mine, because thereby I will be causing him to sin, because eating two sandwiches is twice as bad as eating one. However, if a non-Jewish colleague of mine at work says, oh, I really love this food, this is really my favorite, and I have a big appetite, may I have yours since you're Jewish and you're not going to eat it? I may absolutely give it to him, because there's nothing wrong with a non-Jew eating a ham sandwich or cheeseburger. So there's a difference. So the discussion then becomes, well, what about a Jew putting a stumbling block in front of a non-Jew, meaning that which he's not allowed to do? And the Chassam Sofer clearly rules that that is forbidden for a Jew, and the reason we're bringing this in is because of the next words that he says there, and that is that on the contrary, the Jew is actually obligated to teach him. So it's not enough that I, the Jew, may not allow the non-Jew to transgress any of the seven. I actually have a responsibility to actively inform him and teach him about them. Void Kosva Chassam Sofer, and furthermore the Chassam Sofer wrote, Behemshech Tshuva Hanal, in the same responsa, Dafilu lahakriv karbonos temuto livnei noyach, that even to sacrifice, bnei noyach are permitted to bring sacrifices outside of the holy temple. V'chasav Gemara Zvachim, and the tractate in the Talmud tractate Zvachim says as follows. This is what's written in the Talmud. Sharei loirinhu. It is permitted to instruct them. The Jew is allowed to instruct them step by step and tell them how to bring a proper sacrifice. Uber Rambam muter lo hireisam. And the Rambam's words, exactly the same as the Talmud, just in the Talmud it's in Aramaic and the Rambam it's in Hebrew. It is permissible to instruct them, to teach them. Kloimar, meaning to say, that there isn't over here any bit, it doesn't even touch upon the prohibition of offering a sacrifice outside of the holy temple. That's called shchutei chutz, which is a very big prohibition. A Jew is not allowed to offer a sacrifice outside of the holy temple. There was a time when it was permitted. We're talking about once the temple in Jerusalem was built. From then on, from the time that the first temple in Jerusalem was built, from then on, forever, it is never permissible for a Jew to bring any sacrifice to God anywhere else other than the altar, which is right there on the Temple Mount. Whether the temple has to be standing or not, but let's just speak of the location. He cannot build an altar on his own property, in his own home, in his own yard, or in some public center, and forbidden for the Jew. The Gentile is permitted. A non-Jew is allowed to. So what the Talmud and the Rambam are telling us is that the Jew is allowed to instruct the non-Jew. And why would I think differently if the non-Jew is allowed to? Because since I, the Jew, am not allowed to, so my participation, even though it's just by means of instruction, maybe that counts as shchutei chutz, as sacrificing outside of the permitted place for the Jew. And that's what we're saying, no problem. But yet, the point he wants to make over here is, Nakat Chassam Sofer. But what are the Chassam Sofer's words when he quotes this? The Talmud says shari. The Rambam says mutar. Both those words mean permissible. The Jew is allowed to instruct the non-Jew. Says the Chassam Sofer, the mitzvah lo hiroisam bekach. Actually, it's a mitzvah for the Jew to instruct the non-Jews as to how to bring the sacrifice. That is, in order to bring them closer to the service of God. That's why. So since the goal is that the B'nai Noach, every human being, is to believe in one God, is to serve one God, and that is through keeping His 7 commandments. Therefore, if the non-Jew is permitted to bring a sacrifice, and that will bring him closer to God, then not only is the Jew permitted to help him by instructing him and teaching him the laws and telling him how to do it and teaching him which animal would have a blemish and which wouldn't and what's acceptable for a non-Jew sacrifice, etc. He's actually obligated to. When you read the Talmud, you read the Rambam, you wouldn't necessarily think so because, as we pointed out, the words simply are permissible. Chassam Sofer says it's a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? Again, part of instructing, part of assisting a ben noyach coming closer to God according to God's will. And that brings us to the middle of page 46, and the next section is section Vav, which is 6, and this is going to discuss kfiyah, forcing them in a peaceful manner, how the approach of the Jew is supposed to be. But with that, we conclude this. So pretty clear that the obligation is upon every individual that can. And in the talks, when the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach first started openly campaigning about the observance and the promoting of the 7 Noachide commandments, initially, the examples that he would give, the practical examples were, when he's explaining why things have changed, like we quoted the talk from volume 26 in the Likutei Sichos, is now that the Jew is in an influential position where the non-Jew needs him in the business world, and the non-Jew will listen to him, unlike the way it has been for the past 2,000 years in history. At this point, the non-Jew, in so many cases, needs the Jew, respects the Jew, and will listen to the Jew. And therefore, the Jew, from his end, is taking advantage of him being a successful businessman and making money. Says the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach, that may be nice, but that's not enough. You now have an obligation, a godly obligation, a moral obligation towards that non-Jew who will listen to you, not only to make money off of him, but to actually give him his 7 Noachide commandments. And because he'll listen to you, because you're the philanthropist, because you're the wealthy person, because you're the CEO, or whatever, even on a smaller scale, therefore, you're obligated to. So it's an individual obligation, just as it is a communal obligation. And it all falls under the category of the 7th commandment called dinim. So until next time, wishing everybody much success in teaching, observing, and most importantly, of course, in adhering to and keeping the 7 Noachide commandments, the God-given universal laws for all of mankind, and making this world the perfect world, which is about to come to its full realization as we are entering the era of Mashiach, with a complete revelation of our righteous Mashiach now. Thank you.